the problem I never really expected, and I hadn't anticipated, even though the scaling debate had been going on really quite early, and I couldn't be bothered to look at it because I thought it was too technical for my understanding, was that not everybody in the Bitcoin community was in favor of adoption. And many people got ahead of themselves in thinking that they had invented um, the new digital gold, which would serve as a foundation for a monetary system that would then be layered on top of that many times over. Um, I'm not saying that that's incorrect, but they're way ahead of themselves, and money has to follow a certain evolution, natural evolution through the market. And you can discover this if you read Carl Menger. You can find out how and where money comes from, or you can just look at normal monetary history and see that um, money is an outgrowth of barter. It's a more advanced stage of economic development, but it goes through experimentation. There's entrepreneurship, money, the invention of money and the use of money and the adoption of money on a widespread basis is subject to the normal forces of entrepreneurship that everything else is, whether it's software, things in the digital economy, or really anything, medical treatments, just whatever it is, housing techniques, technology, everything is subject to a market test. And certain developers within the Bitcoin community imagined that they would game the system by artificially restricting the ability of Bitcoin to be adopted on a widespread basis. Now, I didn't understand that in 2013, 2014, 15, 16. I'm trying to think, it's hard to deconstruct these dates now. But there was a point at which I used to use Bitcoin all the time for small purchases, actually plane tickets and coffee and everything else. And I thought that the goal, as it always is, in any kind of monetary innovation, is to seek adoption and use, because you've got a big problem. You've got a network effect to overcome with the dollarization and national monetary systems, generally speaking. So you need people to be able to use it, have friendly interfaces, have producers accept it, consumers adopt it, and see ever more use. That's always the goal of any money. And to my great shock, I woke up one day and discovered that Bitcoin was actually almost unusable, actually. And I felt like my beloved cryptocurrency had been invaded by somebody who was not in favor of it ever becoming a money and had throttled it in a way that made it far less useful and far slower and far more expensive than national money. So obviously, under those conditions, Bitcoin couldn't ever perform, and it was a shock. Very soon after that, of course. And by the way, I'm not just a cryptocurrency researcher, right? So I'm doing research on many other things, international trade issues, antitrust issues, cultural topics. I write about everything. So I went through a couple of years without having risked my career on writing about Bitcoin. I went through a few years. Well, I went through a couple of years of writing about it, took off a couple of years and came back to it and discovered it had to become something like Dr. Frankenstein's monster, something completely unfamiliar to me. And it was all because of the scaling problem. There's just like one flaw and one mistake, and but it ruined any hope that Bitcoin could ever have for overcoming the network effects of the globalization of the dollar as a currency. So I wasn't involved in the fork, but when it happened, and it was shocking when it happened, I didn't even at that point entirely understand why it had to happen. But after it happened, I realized that something had to give, that there had been a fatal flaw at the heart at the Bitcoin developer community that ended up really throttling the chance that Bitcoin, during a very critical period, could have ever become a viable competitor to the dollar. So Bitcoin Cash didn't have a network. It was a brand new currency. It was like starting all over again. But it had to happen because at least the developers of Bitcoin Cash understood that there can't be such a thing as a money that is not useful in exchange. Now, I know this. I've always known this because I've read the works of the Austrian economists, but I'm happy to say that many other, many modern Austrians actually understand this too. And so the great economist George Selgin figured this out very quickly. He realized that Bitcoin couldn't ever be a money under those conditions, that you have to go through a natural stage of evolution. He debated in the Soho Forum in New York, and unfortunately lost the debate. But it's just really sad that many people in the core community have never really thoroughly understood this very important point, that markets have to evolve on a natural way to scale up, scale up, scale up, and eventually become economically viable for the masses of people. So I happen to think that Bitcoin Cash, among probably many others, but I think Bitcoin Cash is probably the top currency in that respect, has the possibility of becoming, basically a hand-to-hand currency, which is to say, widely accepted. But then, and I'm not really part of these debates anymore, but I rallied around BCH, and then it promptly got treated to the Twitter mobs, right? And that was a terrible period. Actually, I didn't like it because I've always been a champion of privatized currencies, whatever form they take. I don't even care what you call it, as long as it's out of the hands of government. So to be accused of, yet again, of being part of a pump and dump scheme, of being a scamster, of all these things, subject to harassment, intimidation, it was horrible. And actually, at the time, people had warned me that if I showed any sympathy for the fork at all, that I would be subjected to this. But it was far worse than I really imagined, and nobody wants to live that way. It's disgusting. Now, as far as I know, these days, and I'm not maybe that active, or maybe I've just blocked all the right people, but it doesn't seem like the abuse is continuing as much as possible. Back in the day, when after the fork occurred, we kept hearing again and again about second and third tier layer solutions are going to be piled on top of BTC. And yeah, I'm all for that. That all sounds great. But it always struck me as overly rationalistic and overly pre-programmed, as if the smartest people in the world were going to gamify the invention of a new monetary base, but they never really wanted to bother with the market, which is the strangest thing, because actually the greatest thing about a cryptocurrency is that, over national monies, is that it's actually part of the market experience, unlike national monies that were basically nationalized and imposed by governments and throttled in their development. And so the great thing about cryptocurrency is it's supposed to be adaptable and changed. As far as I know, that is the essence of the BCH developer community today. So I'm actually very optimistic. I'm very frustrated that it's taking so long to get there. But I've been frustrated since I first discovered Bitcoin. And again, my excitement about Bitcoin was not really this sort of abstract intellectual position that it would become, some base money for the world. The real test, and this is true now, and it'll always be true, the real test of a cryptocurrency is whether or not a regular person can find it useful and a regular merchant can accept it. I must tell you, it's actually been a very strange thing, because Bitcoin was supposed to be adaptable and progressive and move forward in history in a way in which the dollar couldn't. In 2013 and 2014, you could go anywhere at PorcFest in New Hampshire, or really many big cities had lots of merchants that were accepting Bitcoin. You could spend it, you could use it, you could trade it, and it was very common. In the years that's since then, it's been ever less and ever less and ever less. So adoption has actually gone down. I've been a part of debates for some years with advocates of Bitcoin Core, who actually, it's a consistent position, I guess, but they're against adoption. They don't want you to adopt the HODL movement, right? Now, then at some point, I began to get frustrated by this, and I really began to notice that the HODL movement and amongst the BTCers were mostly the old gangsters, which some people would consider me among them. I don't know. I mean, 2013 doesn't sound that old, but that what they began to get upset about was competition in the crypto realm. They thought there should only be one cryptocurrency, and they thought that every new cryptocurrency would diminish the status and value of BTC, which to them hurt their holdings. Now, to me, once I discovered that this was actually the motivation, struck me as an outrageously, like an economically ignorant, backwards, and mercantilist, even protectionist outlook, and fundamentally selfish. In other words, you want to throttle the development of cryptocurrency just so that your gangster, your old gangster original token can be as valued as high as possible. That's contrary to free enterprise. It's contrary to competition. It's contrary to economic logic, and actually smacks of a kind of what you might call kind of a crypto fascism, actually. And it took me a while to realize that this is what's going on, but that's definitely struck me at some point that is at least in part of the motivation for the BTC HODL movement. And I think it's not a future for humanity. It's a future for a few, but it's not a future for the whole world.